For 3 years, Wikileaks founder Julian Assange has sought asylum within the Ecuadorian embassy in London at a cost of millions of pounds. He has been facing sexual assault allegations which actually expired this past week, although he could still face charges on a rape allegation for a further 5 years. John Pilger is an Australian-born journalist and filmmaker. He's twice won Britain's Journalist of the Year award, and he says it's been an unrelenting campaign by Sweden and the US to deny Julian Assange justice and, of course, his freedom. And John Pilger is in no doubt about the impact that Assange and Wikileaks has had on society.
I think it's had a huge impact on both society and on journalism. I mean, the best of journalism, in my experience, always relied on what we call whistleblowers, people from inside who can tell us the things that vested interests and governments don't want us to know. And I think they've done that with such a dimension that we now have quite a different standard of investigative journalism now to reach. And as far as society is concerned, I think they've told people what so many people, millions of people suspected anyway, that their governments weren't telling them the truth, and that vested interests weren't telling them the truth, that they were being deceived, that democracy wasn't working properly, that there wasn't the kind of accountability that they suspected. Wikileaks' contribution to that, I think, has been quite extraordinary.
It's been compared, hasn't it, to Daniel Ellsberg's revelation of the Pentagon Papers, US war-related secrets in 1971. Do you think that's a fair or valid comparison?
Yes, it is, absolutely. I know Dan Ellsberg, and I've talked to him about it, and he makes that comparison, that he's very much a supporter of WikiLeaks now. I mean, what Ellsberg released, and this was a whistleblower from within the system, the Pentagon Papers actually told the truth about the Vietnam War. It told the truth, the kind of official truths that people didn't know. They were official documents, and they really had an extraordinary impact then on public opinion. They supported that old truth that information is power. People then had information. Now, what people do with information is up to them, but to be able to get it, as they got it through Ellsberg, and they've got it through WikiLeaks, and they got it through Chelsea Manning, and they've got it through numerous other very courageous whistleblowers, that's very important, and it's a lesson for us journalists.
The nature of the whistleblower, let me ask you this then, John. Daniel Ellsberg over 40 years ago, Julian Assange now, to many he's a hero. People like Yoko Ono and Ken Loach have visited him at the Ecuadorian embassy. But what did people think of Daniel Ellsberg at the time? Because there's been quite a level of vitriol to Julian Assange. How was Daniel Ellsberg treated by the public and by the establishment?
I think Ellsberg was also really subjected to a certain level of vitriol. Usually whistleblowers are. I remember Ellsberg actually being called a traitor.
Really?
And indeed, he won his court actions, which were really based on that broad allegation that he'd committed some form of treason. So, his character was called into question and so on, in a different way from the attacks on Julian Assange, another great whistleblower, long forgotten, who's now the subject of a movie called, interestingly, Shoot the Messenger. His name is Gary Webb. Gary Webb disclosed in the United States how the CIA was involved in drug trafficking into the United States. Now, Gary Webb's greatest enemies were the rest of the media, who hadn't got the story and attacked him. Now, something similar has happened with Julian Assange. It's certainly muddied by the fact that he was caught in a situation in Sweden which those who were his enemies anyway were able to exploit. But my understanding, and I've known Assange for quite some time, and I've followed this case very quickly, is that the amount of vitriol comes down to the degree of truth-telling about great power. There is, and I've found this in my own career, there is a real ruthlessness in great power, be it in governments, big corporations, vested interests, particularly in very, very powerful governments. There is a ruthlessness in their response if you expose what they are doing and if it's something that they don't want the public to know about.
And you've experienced it yourself?
Yes, I have, most certainly. In a lot of the work I've done right throughout Southeast Asia and in investigative work in the UK, for example, I had a lot to do with revealing the thalidomide, the extent that thalidomide, the drug, was damaging children. I found myself subjected to all kinds of abuse and smear. Smear is probably an investigative journalist's greatest enemy. There was a very interesting document that Wikileaks got hold of in 2008, which foretold everything, almost everything that has happened to Julian Assange. It said that, and I paraphrase it, that because Wikileaks was revealing so many of these truths, the only way to deal with it was to discredit it, and to discredit Assange, to smear, in other words. I mean, it really spells it out in very plain English that there's going to be a campaign of discrediting against anyone like Assange who dares to tell the public the kind of secrets that it needs to know but is prevented from knowing.
Well, in fact, you say on Julian Assange, you write that in Alexandria, Virginia, a secret grand jury has spent 5 years attempting to contrive a crime for which Assange can be prosecuted. Can you explain that a little bit for us? What do you mean by that?
Well, yes. I mean, that's they've admitted that now. There is in Virginia, which the grand jury in the United States grand juries draw from the area in which they sit. Now, this area has in it the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, and all the great institutions of American power. So that determines really the character of the grand jury, and the grand jury can then issue indictments. Now, this grand jury has been sitting in secret now for several years, and it's the problem it faces in trying to bring a charge against Assange and WikiLeaks is that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, says very clearly that whistleblowers, truth-tellers, are protected by it, by the Constitution. And ironically, it was President Obama, a professor of constitutional law, who said very early in his presidency that whistleblowers had the protection of the Constitution. Now, and I say ironically because more whistleblowers have been prosecuted under Obama than during all the presidents in the past. So this grand jury has an uphill task, and the one charge that it seems it might be able to come up with is a First World War espionage charge, which was really directed at conscientious objectors during the First World War all those years ago, a century ago. That's all it can find. The problem there is that Julian Assange isn't an American. That never seems to bother American courts, that there are some people in the world who are not Americans. So it's a difficulty, but there's no question that what the documents show, the FBI has something like a 50,000-page file on him. What all these documents that have come out have shown, and what they've virtually admitted, that the moment Assange steps out of the door of the Ecuadorian embassy in London, in some way, the United States, with help from its so-called allies, will get its hands on Julian Assange.
And is that why the 24-hour, around-the-clock police cordon, the police sort of peering?
Well, no, because they don't prevent people going in, but Assange isn't going anywhere. All that is, this 24-hour cordon, it's theatrical. It's a show of force by the state. It's the British government saying, and the Metropolitan Police in London saying, we're not having this. How dare this man go and seek political refuge and be granted it by another government? It's pointless.
John,
one policeman outside the door is more than enough because, as everybody knows, Assange isn't going anywhere.
I'm speaking with journalist John Pilger, and there are those who listen to this too who will say that these charges, these allegations,
you've got to be careful with that. That's a very common slip, and I understand you make it. Assange's the disgrace about all this is this man has not been charged with anything. What's more, that the original prosecutor in this case in Sweden threw allegations out, and the second prosecutor who has pursued him allowed him to leave Sweden and said, that's fine. This second prosecutor has been offered every facility to question Julian Assange over 5 years. The British government has pleaded with her virtually to come to London. It's a normal procedure. At the same time, Sweden has, in London, interviewed something like 44 other people connected with allegations in Sweden, but not Assange.
So what's going on there? Why?
Why? Well, I think it's a combination of reasons here. There's no evidence. That's number one. I've seen the evidence. There's no evidence. Both these women have said they were not raped. They both said it's consensual. It was consensual sex. Their SMS messages, one says that the police have tried to railroad them into this. The pressures on these two women have been extraordinary, and one can only have sympathy for them. It's a combination of why. There's an obsession about this prosecutor, and my sense is that the Swedish authorities haven't quite known what to do about it. The Swedish High Court has reprimanded her for not getting on with the case.
Is this Marianne Nye?
Yes. Marianne Nye.
What's the relationship, John, between Washington and Stockholm? Is because Sweden is, meant to be something of a liberal bastion, isn't it? So what sort of relationship do they have?
No, Sweden is not an illiberal bastion. Sweden is basked in it is in some areas. Yes, it has enlightened social policies towards the vulnerable and the elderly and so on, though these have been much broken down over the years. But in a cultural sense, that image of Sweden going back to the 1960s as a great libertarian country no longer exists. Sweden has rather a dark side. It's not a member of NATO, but it's almost a much more committed associate of the United States in that part of the world. And the last government in Sweden had very close links with the extreme right in the Republican Party. And it has various associations in the arms business and so on. So Sweden has I suppose Sweden plays the same games that countries within a certain sphere of influence do these days. It is no different from that. But what it does have is, as I mentioned, is a very close relationship with the US. And the Independent newspaper here revealed that there had been discussions between the Swedish authorities and the US on Assange. I don't think anyone really has any serious doubts that should Assange go to Sweden, where there is no bail, therefore he would go straight into prison regardless of having not been charged with anything, that once confined, that something similar would happen to him as has happened to other people who have been subjected to rendition to the United States from Sweden. This is all guesswork, of course, but the assumption has a great deal of credibility.
John Pilger, how do you think then this will play out? He's about, 3 years inside this Ecuadorian embassy, as I understand it. You might have gone and visited him, but as I understand it, no sunlight, a small room. Ken Loach, the film director, he gave him a walker, I think, one of those exercise machines, didn't he? So what's going to happen is my question.
I see Julian Assange regularly, and I've seen him in the embassy many times, and it's a room inside. It's like your living room and my living room. Yes, some light comes in through the window, but with the police pretty well outside, you have to keep the curtains closed. Otherwise, you've got a member of the constabulary looking in on you. And so it's a very confined space, and it's the kind of thing that no human being should have to go through. It's the sort of detention that really is against all the post-war covenants of human rights and so on. But it is a place of refuge, and that's why he's there.
Finally, John Pilger, before you go, I just wondered if I could grab a couple of thoughts on the Labour leadership in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader contender, he continues to do well in the polls. In fact, the press has dubbed it Corbyn mania. His views are very much to the left of the Labour mainstream. He wants to, withdraw from NATO, abolish the UK's nuclear arsenal. So can I ask you, where is he drawing his support, and why do you think it's happening?
It's something about the mainstream when you describe it that way. Jeremy Corbyn is actually the mainstream. And who these people are, it's such fun to watch them so hysterical over somebody who might be democratically elected by ordinary people. What a terrible thing to happen. They used to call this democracy. But because they've stitched up the system for such a long time, especially since the rise of Tony Blair and his evangelical followers who dominate the Labour Party still, because this man who has rather moderate views and old-fashioned views, the kind of old-fashioned views that most people subscribe to, and because people are so frustrated all over the world, I'm sure it's true in New Zealand as well, it certainly is in Australia, are frustrated that there isn't a functioning democracy, that the views of people, the frustrations of people are not reflected by their politicians. Suddenly up comes a man who, first of all, he's completely incorruptible, he's decent, he doesn't abuse people, he doesn't play all their games, he doesn't want to go to war with countries, he doesn't want to bomb countries, he doesn't want to see people impoverished, and he doesn't want to see extremely rich interests make off with billions of pounds. For having these outrageous views, thoroughly outrageous, extremist views, Jeremy Corbyn has attracted an enormous support from people. I was in Edinburgh recently and I gave a talk, and I would have thought that probably most of the people in the audience had voted for the SNP, had voted for independence. Were they interested in Corbyn, even up there? So I don't know. I think it's very likely he'll be elected leader of the Labour Party. Whether or not he can get through, then keep that rather corrupted organisation in a shape that it might win an election, I have no idea. But he's certainly he's cheered people up. He's given them a sense that maybe some things are possible.
Journalist and filmmaker John Pilger, thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.